Hello everyone, welcome to the benefit of ethics for land IoT for landlords and the official launch for Connected and Fair report conducted by University of Bristol. We've got a jam-packed agenda this afternoon, really exciting and looking at different dimensions of ethics. But before we start going through the agenda, this is about ethics and it's meant to be an interactive session. So please keep the chat function going during the whole duration of the presentation this afternoon. We've got question and answers there, so keep asking questions and questions throughout every single presentation, and we're returning back. I did say it's going to be an interactive presentation this afternoon. I will be asking you poll questions shortly. But the agenda, we've got a really good agenda, haven't we, Chris, this afternoon?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's exactly what we need for this. I think we've got stuff with Sam Collier from the University of Bristol. We're talking about the ethics research he's been doing that's been getting some good traction in the industry, and that's what this is about. It's about the launch of that. And then we're following that up with Stephen Blackburn, who's Digital Innovation Manager in Leeds, who's managing a number of different smart cities projects, but also something we're doing around resident health and wellbeing. So yeah, we're in a very good place for that.
And then we'll be taking live Q&A. So our question to you is, to firstly start off, is have you considered ethics in the deployment of the Internet of Things? So we'd like you to vote now. So the question is, have you considered ethics in the deployment of Internet of Things? So getting your polls in, we're just going to see how we go with them. We've got up to 70%. Let's carry on. And there's still more votes coming through. There's plenty of you in already, so please carry on voting. So far we have approximately 63% of you say that you have considered ethics in the deployment of Internet of Things. That's quite a high number, isn't it, when you say, Chris?
Yeah, so it's also not too bad, but clearly ethics needs to be considered generally. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that changes in the future.
Chris, could you just give us a bit of an overview of Internet of Things and where this research has really come from?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's probably best to think, throughout history, technology and innovations had a profoundly important impact on society, from improving people's health, extending life, through to reducing poverty. But clearly, technology is just a tool, really, and all it does is amplify, someone's ability to do something. So it can clearly be used in both a negative and a positive way. And a good example of that would be a knife can be used to give someone life-saving surgery, but it can also be used as a weapon. So it's right that people are skeptical about new technologies, and it's important to ask that question around ethics at an early stage. Probably more relevant example to us would be in the 1980s, when personal computers were becoming more prevalent. People were very, very skeptical of them. There was huge concerns around privacy and ethics. People were very concerned that the government, who was starting to adopt computers, would be able to collect data centrally and share it between departments. Now, for us now, that seems quite mundane, and you can't really imagine society without that level of efficiency. It doesn't seem feasible. Having said that, there are still challenges with data, but again, it's more from new technologies like artificial intelligence. IoT is really just an extension of that kind of computer age. After all, an IoT device is basically a small computer that's carrying out a specific task. And why it's really relevant to us in this sector, there's been huge sort of progress around IoT. Just even looking at ACO over the last 18 months, I've now got 50,000 connected devices in social homes. That's not contracts won or anything like that. This is currently receiving data from 50,000 devices, and that was during lockdown times. This is growing really, really rapidly. From our own background experience with HomeLink and trying lots of different technologies together, we've deployed obviously smoke and CO alarms, environment sensors, but also things like smart locks, water leak detectors, a number of things. And something we saw early on was that, there's a kind of spectrum in terms of what's acceptable. Some things, people aren't really worried about, and some things they are. And there's a big grey area in the middle. If you use your intuition, most people will see that, it's quite obvious that actually a maintenance event from a fire alarm isn't really controversial and nobody's worried about that. But obviously also putting cameras in people's homes is completely unacceptable, and you wouldn't even think of that. The issue is in the middle, where everyone has different opinions on what it is, and there's this grey area. For example, a motion detector might be acceptable for people with assisted living needs, but maybe it's not acceptable for the general population. That's not a question that we could intuitively answer very, very easily. So it's important that that we needed to do this research. There's a huge opportunity for a win-win scenario. A lot of our customers might be would raise some concerns around ethics and things like that. And that's why we follow a certain approach. And that's really the key. So this win-win for landlords and residents needs to be there. There has to be something for the resident. It has to sort of be acceptable to most residents. And for us, it was really important to answer those questions and try and understand what that is. So we approached Bristol University. We wanted to understand from them. We wanted them to do some unbiased and statistically significant research. Ask as many residents and landlords as they needed to. Ask them questions around what's acceptable, what isn't, what's their understanding of technology and various things, so that we could then take that information and allow it to inform our product and allow it to inform how we all kind of shape this sector to make sure it goes in that right direction. So, which is why we've got Sam Collier from Bristol University to sort of take us off with his initial presentation as part of this launch of our ethics research. So, Sam.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Tina. Thanks for having me here today. So as Chris mentioned, I've been leading on this research with HomeLink, looking at the ethics of IoT and the kind of key areas of the discussion and the debate that we need to kind of move forward with. Are we good with the slides? Great. So I'm, as Chris mentioned, a PhD researcher at the University of Bristol, and I'm also the ethics and sustainability lead at HomeLink. I'm just going to whip through a few things about IoT for social housing to start with, and just give you an intro and a bit more of a background of what IoT is for social housing. I will give you an overview of ethical IoT and the kind of considerations that we can bring in to make our IoT programs more ethical. Then I'll go on to the research that we conducted and give you an overview of that and some of the key results. And then moving on to some of the outputs from the research, looking at a framework of ethical principles, and then some key recommendations. So just to start with, what is the Internet of Things? Basically, it's the network of connected devices that are linked together by the internet. So there could be sensors, it could be alarms, wearables like Fitbits, your smartphone, smart speakers, other smart devices within your home. Combined with artificial intelligence, we can leverage the data that comes from those technologies to provide a powerful and a valuable tool for decision making. Basically making the technologies that we have in the homes even more powerful. So why would we want to do this in social homes? Well, we can use them to learn more about our homes, helping to keep them safe and habitable, and looking at things like fire safety, the health impacts of living in homes that are potentially substandard, and also dealing with issues like fuel poverty and other social issues. And we can also use the tools and the data that we get from the technologies to reduce and ultimately eradicate some of the preventable issues that occur in social homes. So at the moment we're looking at condensation, damp and mold, poor quality housing more generally, and then energy efficiency. Just to go into that a little bit more deeply, some key areas where social landlords can benefit from IoT. So proactive maintenance, we can use insights that are developed from the data and the artificial intelligence to provide insights to identify and resolve different problems within social homes. It gives us a remote visibility of our housing stock and ensure that everything is as it should be. We can use it for enhanced asset management, so use the data to provide us with a tool for decision making, not necessarily to make those decisions, but as a tool to inform our decisions and make sure we're making better decisions. We can use it to log events and have an audit trail looking at different incidents within our social homes. And it also provides us a real-time a way of notifying us in real time for potential risks. So moving on to kind of the ethical implementation of IoT and how do we do it in the right way. Professor Luciano Floridi at the Digital Ethics Lab at the University of Oxford has quite a nice quote. He says, ethics comes before the rules, during the rules, and after the rules. So it encompasses everything around that, and I'll show you a bit more about that in a second. So by taking an ethical approach to IoT, we can minimize the risk of harm, and ultimately, we want to only do good with the technologies that we implement in social housing. We want to minimize that risk of harm. As those actors installing the technologies within homes, landlords and technology suppliers have the responsibility to ensure that we're minimizing that risk of harm. It enables us to address concerns across different contexts. So if we take an ethical approach, we can look at people's different contexts are looking at culture, geography, different wider factors beyond just individual circumstances, and allows us to look at issues across that broader context. The speed of technological innovation is a bit of a barrier for us in terms of being able to ensure that ethical approaches are taken, and we need to make sure that we kind of consider the ethical issues beyond those that are covered by legislation. So we kind of have a kind of a disconnect between the speed of technological innovation and the legislation that should accompany it. So taking an ethical approach can deal with some of those issues prior to legislation being implemented. And then finally, ultimately, for these technologies to be successful and useful in their outputs, we need broader acceptance of IoT. And also wider technology, so you can think about maybe the decarbonisation agenda. There's lots of technologies that we'll need to bring in for that, and we need wider acceptance of those technologies. Just looking quickly at what ethics itself is. So generally, it's a system of moral principles that guide individuals or groups. So we all have this system of ethics, and it enables us to ask questions about what is right and wrong. We'll have different systems of ethics, so those questions might be different for us, and there'll be a whole spectrum across society. It also looks at rights and responsibilities, and ultimately that moral ethical system enables us to make decisions based on what we believe is right and wrong. And it's influenced by a number of characteristics, including personal characteristics in our upbringing, social norms which change over time, and cultural factors. Also religion, other contextual factors like geography and politics. So if we think about the UK, our ethics is very different to perhaps China. Legal considerations. So legal considerations frame the ethical debate. They kind of show what is legislated for is kind of what needs to be done based on law, and the ethics around that, the issues around that, sorry, are kind of can be brought in to that ethical debate. And then time is another key influence on ethics. So if you think about what was ethical 20 or 30 years ago, that is likely to be very different to what's ethical right now. So in terms of social housing, we have a number of regulations that kind of guide practice. So we've got GDPR, Social Housing White Paper, the Homes Act 2018, different strategic priorities, something that we and there's other regulations as well, and then something we don't have yet, but they might be coming in the future, IoT standards, which should frame some of this debate. But around all that kind of legislation and regulation, we have kind of ethics, and ethics includes these things, but also frames the debate around it. So we just need to think about the wider picture and make sure that what we're doing is basically for good and isn't doing harm. And just to frame that into a kind of nice framework for you, this comes from bioethics, but it's really quite applicable for this example. So there's five principles here that will find a frame ethical practice, and these are questions you can ask yourself when you're thinking about implementing IoT in social homes. So the first thing is beneficence. So you just need to ask yourself, how can we do good, or is what we are doing good? Non-maleficence. So how do we avoid doing harm? Are we doing harm by what we're doing, and how do we avoid it? Autonomy. So how do we preserve human agency in what we're doing? And indeed, we can enhance human agency as well using technology. Justice. How do we ensure fairness and equity within what we're doing? And explainability. So is what we're doing understandable to the layperson, or the person who is kind of affected by in this case, the technologies within their homes. Just some examples of kind of concerns from some social residents within our research, looking at different ethical issues. I'll give you a sec just to read through those. Basically, there's concerns about technologies being used for purposes beyond what they were meant to be used for. Shifting blame, that kind of thing. Concerns about what the technology actually is for, and who it should be relevant for. Concerns about technology and health, and how the technology itself is impacting people's health. The environmental impact of technology, and then discussions about power and agenda, and basically who makes decisions, why they make these decisions, and who's involved in that decision making. So as kind of we'll frame ourselves as governance actors, landlords, housing associations, other groups within the social housing sector, and technology companies. How can we contribute to ensuring kind of an ethical approach? There's two ways we can do it. So we can take an ethical approach to governance, and we can also take an ethical approach to the technology itself. In terms of governance, that includes things like decision making, thinking about who's making those decisions, how those decision making processes work. Transparency, so informing people why we're doing something, how we're doing it, and what the purpose of it is. Building trust, different processes that we can use to build trust, but trust comes out as a key factor in terms of improving resident acceptance in our research. Clearly communicating the purpose of data collection, bringing in kind of robust feedback and auditing mechanisms to ensure that what we're doing continues to be ethical and accepted. Thinking about codes of practice and how we can develop kind of best practice in the sector. And at the moment, ethics is something that's kind of an afterthought, or something that's not directly embedded within the decision-making processes. So if we can, as a sector, develop codes of practice, that will only do good. And then providing information. This is a key aspect in terms of including people within the kind of technology transition. Providing information about the benefits and also the potential risks of IoT to both the sector and to residents themselves. And then thinking about technology, there's things we can do within technologies to make them kind of more ethical. The first is bias, embedded bias. This is both within the models we use to come up with insights, but also within the human aspect of the technology, both in terms of kind of what we decide to use it for, but also everyone has embedded biases within them, and when we develop the models themselves, those biases will come out in those models. So we just need to be much clearer on what biases exist, and how we can kind of find novel ways to overcome them. We need to look at data quality, so we need to ensure that the data is fit for purpose and of a sufficient quality to do the job we want it to do. Data sharing, so we need to think about who will have access to the data, why they will have that access, and the purpose of it. Data ownership. We need to decide about who owns that data. The home within which those technologies are going is inhabited by people who aren't necessarily installing those technologies. So we need to have a discussion about who owns that data. The landlords may say that they own the technologies, but the technologies themselves are not the things that we're concerned about here. It's the data that they're collecting. So I mentioned the data needs to be fit for purpose, but also the technologies need to be fit for purpose. They need to be, we need to ensure that they're working well, put in places, for example, located within homes to do their job properly, and also not doing things that they shouldn't be doing. The technologies need to be usable by kind of a bottom line, so we need to ensure that people aren't kind of left behind in terms of kind of technology awareness and usability. So we need to ensure that people can use the technologies that we put in their homes and understand how they use them and kind of the right way to use them. And then finally, user empowerment. So in terms of the design of the technologies, we can do things to empower the users rather than kind of having power over them. So our research project, we spoke to more than 500 social residents, 50 industry actors, and we asked them a series of questions looking at their demographics, landlord relationship, their home, and the usefulness and comfort they had with different IoT technologies. Industry actors were asked about their organization, their role within that organization, and what they perceive to be the purpose of IoT. And both groups were asked about benefits, risks, and priorities for IoT and their familiarity with different technologies. This was IoT technologies, but also technologies that they might be more familiar with already. And just to flag here that the social residents that we spoke to were residents that had yet to experience IoT within their homes. We hadn't installed any technologies. So this is kind of prior to use. So from the research, a number of benefits emerged, perceived benefits emerged. Both groups saw IoT to provide them with greater convenience. Both groups also saw that IoT could improve resident safety. If you can see kind of the general trend here in the benefits is that organizations perceived IoT to be kind of more beneficial than residents did. As we move down the chart, kind of the divergence between the groups gets more and more. So we look at enabling compliance, for example. Social residents didn't see this as a kind of a key benefit, whereas obviously it is for social landlords. So we just need to have a look at these tensions and see how we can kind of inform both sides about those benefits. And even some residents perceive there to be no benefits of IoT. So we will have those that push back. Looking at the risks, data privacy is a key risk for both groups, as well as problems with data sharing, so who we share it with and how we do it. And if you look at the trend here, it's kind of flipped around the other way. So residents perceive there to be more risks with IoT than those working in the sector. There's some other kind of key issues further down, so kind of looking at trust and how the benefits wouldn't be realized based on a lack of trust in both the technology itself, but also a lack of trust in organizations, and that included the landlord themselves and also technology companies. And small group of both residents and social housing organizations perceive there to be no drawbacks or risks to IoT. Just zooming in a bit closer to some of these tensions, and I'll just touch on a few here. If you look at the top, I think privacy again there comes out as a key issue for both residents and industry actors. But if we look at this one here, data generated by IoT in social homes should be owned by the resident. There's a clear distinction here in the perspective of the two groups. We're talking 85% of social residents agree that it should be owned by them. They should own that data. Whereas if you look at industry actors, less than 50% think that the residents should own it. So there's a tension there that we need to think about and overcome. Landlords should be able to use IoT however they choose, so long as they meet existing regulations. Both sides there are very kind of split on that, and this is kind of touching on the ethical debate. So regulations are there for a reason, but they don't necessarily have to guide all action within the sector, and we can look beyond them to think about the kind of ethical issues that might emerge beyond that legislation. And then, as Chris mentioned earlier, some types of data collection in social homes do not require resident consent. And here, there's over half of residents disagreed with this statement, whereas there are some obvious use cases, such as in fire safety, where the data is kind of really key to collect and can mean the difference with someone's life. So here, I think landlords are more likely to have kind of understood this aspect of it. But so we're looking at a spectrum here, and there's kind of a different level of acceptability based on certain factors. And here, this is certain technologies and their use cases. So looking at resident acceptance, we wanted to understand the factors that influence resident acceptance, looking at improving that level of acceptance. And we came up with a framework to kind of understand acceptance. We looked at both usefulness or perceived usefulness of the technology, and then their perceptions of how comfortable they would be with the technology in their homes. And we asked them about these 7 technologies and how useful and comfortable they would be with them. And as you can see, kind of the safety aspect of things comes out on top. They see as connected fire alarms as extremely useful, and also they'd be extremely comfortable having those technologies within their homes. If we move down, the technologies, kind of the data that we can, the use cases of the data that we have as we move down, so looking at humidity sensors, indoor air quality, the picture becomes a bit more, unclear, but in both cases, people still kind of see these technologies as both useful and they are comfortable with them. It's just kind of, I guess, an education piece here and understanding what we can do with those technologies and why they would be put in their homes. So using the scores that came from the usefulness and how comfortable they be with the technologies, we came up with these 8 factors, and they're all statistically significant factors in terms of influencing resident acceptance. Perceived convenience of the technologies, as we mentioned earlier, convenience and the perceptions of that convenience increased resident acceptance. The compatibility with their existing lifestyle, so how well those technologies would just integrate within their existing home, and those that perceived technologies to be more compatible were more likely to be accepting of them. Risk aversion was the next one, so those who were more risk averse were less likely to be accepting of the technologies. Perceived ease of use, so this goes back to the usability angle. Those who perceived the technologies to be more easier to use were more accepting of them. Trust in governance actors being social landlords and the technology providers, and those who have more trust in those actors were more likely to be accepting the technologies. Those who perceived the technologies to enhance their autonomy were more likely to be accepting. Females tended to be more accepting of the technologies, and then the age group 65 and over tended to be less accepting of those technologies. So if we can just think about those factors when implementing our IoT technologies, thinking about how we can improve usability or how it might embed within someone's life, can be ways in to kind of improve acceptance. And in doing so, we can kind of deal with some of the ethical issues at source. So out of the research, we kind of mapped some key concerns of both social residents and organizations within the sector onto some kind of broader global level AI frameworks, AI ethical frameworks. So we wanted to basically embed our ethical framework within kind of a bit more of the academic literature to make it a bit more robust, than just kind of framing it within our own research. So we've come up with 8 principles to frame the ethical framework, and I think we've had a question about this, so in the Q&A. So the framework we've come up with has the 8 principles: resident privacy, fairness, equity, and non-discrimination, improving human welfare, avoiding misuse of data, public awareness and knowledge, cybersecurity, transparency and explainability, and autonomy. And I'll go through each of those in turn now and just give you a bit more information about those and just some ideas about about the key issues that come under those headings. So looking at resident privacy, we need to ask questions about what data are collected, how they're stored and used, and how consent's obtained, why we want that data basically, and what the purpose of it is. There's a tension between providing, giving up or providing our personal information, but also benefiting more from the technologies. And there's kind of a trade-off or perceived trade-off between the two, and we need to think about that. The decision-making processes within social housing are obscure, so they obscure the situation. So those who make the decisions aren't necessarily those who are affected directly by the technology. So we need to think about who's included in those decisions and how those decisions are made. And ultimately, if we look at the Human Rights Act, everyone has the right to respect for their private and family life, their home, and their correspondence. So within those homes, even the Human Rights Act suggests that privacy, data privacy, just general privacy about our lives is a basic human right. So we need to think about that. In terms of fairness, equity, and non-discrimination, we need to think about the risk that we have of reinforcing deeply entrenched social inequality. So if we're doing harm with these technologies, we have the capacity to reinforce the existing inequalities within social housing. We need to think about how we can ensure fair access and opportunity. There's different ways to do that, but we need to ensure that those who want to participate can, and those who want to kind of exclude themselves from it are also able to do that. We need to ensure that those who participate aren't disadvantaged by their choice to do so. We need to thinking again about data privacy and harm. Those who decide to participate in IoT, we need to ensure that they are protected from any kind of risk of harm. And then we need to acknowledge that there are both technical and kind of human biases embedded within the technologies, and find new ways to address them. And I think social housing is an example where some of those biases will be more kind of evident. Improving human welfare. So the primary purpose of the technology should be to improve people's lives, and it should be in the best interest of those affected. We need to ensure that whilst the technologies might be providing broad-scale benefit, we need to ensure that individuals aren't negatively impacted, and look at those individual cases to ensure that we can do things to make sure that they are not kind of marginalized. We need to acknowledge that IoT and AI are powerful tools, but use them for decision-making rather than allowing them to make the decisions for us. And there are a few examples of this where allowing technologies to make those decisions for us can ultimately end in kind of undesirable impacts. A really kind of rough example of that is kind of the kind of autonomous vehicle accidents that we've had through Tesla, and basically we need to ensure that we are still in control of those technologies, and we're making decisions based on what they chuck out rather than allowing them to do it for us. The technologies themselves it's really hard to kind of program human values like compassion and empathy and fairness. So we need to acknowledge that that's the case, and embed different ways of decision making to overcome that. And we need to use technology in a way that doesn't reduce the capacity of future generations to meet their needs. Environmental impact was a thing brought up earlier that residents have kind of brought up before. Avoiding the misuse of data. So we need to ensure that data they're used for the reason they're intended. Need to ensure there's trust between landlords and residents, and that the use cases are kind of clearly communicated, and trust is a key way of kind of ensuring that. We need to ensure there's robust data management and use, and minimize the risk of malpractice through different things we can do with the data. So that might be anonymization, data aggregation, different ways of eliminating the utility of the data for other people, and that can reduce the risk of misuse. Improving public awareness and knowledge is really key. Currently, we've got a lack of public knowledge of digital technologies and how they operate, and how we can kind of get the best from them. This is uneven between different groups, and between, you think about different age groups, or maybe those who are less familiar with the technologies. So we need to ensure that kind of public awareness and public literacy, digital literacy programs are targeted at the right people. We need greater levels of literacy across many different topics. So looking at like how data is generated, how it's collected, its analysis, its use, who owns it, the security of it, and we can then use that technology to empower individuals to make better informed judgments. So if they want to be included in this transition, they have more information and knowledge about it. They're also able to participate more, and also able to act more responsibly with that data. Cybersecurity. Our lives are becoming increasingly more online, and we need to be confident in the spaces we inhabit online. And so just like we are in kind of the real world, offline, we need confidence in those spaces. We need to improve that across the whole of society. In settings such as social housing, where there's unequal power distribution, we need to it's even more of a call for feeling secure. We need to ensure that those spaces that are being opened up by more digital technologies and new innovation are accompanied by robust cybersecurity. Opening up those spaces leads to greater possibility of exposure to kind of malicious threats. And we need to ensure that cybersecurity is kind of greater importance where people have limited control over those technologies and what they're doing and how they're doing it. And the final two, so transparency and explainability. Behaving transparently, ensuring intention and purpose clearly communicated, contribute to building trust. And again, trust here, we need to find new ways of building it, and transparency is a key way to do that. Provide clear information on benefit and risk, and ensuring that residents are well informed is another key way of building transparency. Basically leveling up this situation where knowledge levels might be imbalanced, and that can aid in terms of transparency. Explainability, as we mentioned earlier, kind of looking at how the extent to which we can understand how a system produces a certain output, so how the inputs are translated into the output. And if we produce systems that are like that, then those who kind of affected by them can see how they're working and why they're doing that. And explainability also enables us to kind of decompartmentalize those parts of the process so that we can see how we can influence certain parts of it, looking at policy, regulation, and ethics. And finally, autonomy. Technology is both an enabler and an enhancer of autonomy. We need to make sure that we use the technology to empower people, so improve their lives rather than having power over them and being able to do things that are slightly, less ethical. And the kind of conflict over understanding who owns the data is something that needs to be dealt with. It may play a key role in empowering people and therefore treating them as autonomous individuals. So recommendations from the report, we've broken them up into governance ethics and technology ethics. In terms of governance, these are just some ways in which we can start acting now in terms of embedding ethics within IoT in social homes. So the first thing is we can involve those most affected in decision making. So finding ways to those most affected in decision making. So we can find ways to bring residents into the conversation and find out what their key concerns are and how we can overcome those issues. We need to work collaboratively across the sector. There's not going to be a clear definition of what's ethical and what isn't. It's not going to be as black and white as that. We need to ensure that the kind of broad range of issues are brought up, and only by working collaboratively will we be able to do that. We need to ensure there are robust mechanisms for accountability. Transparency, again, really key in building trust and finding new ways to be transparent. And then find ways to contribute to public digital literacy. Again, being able to level the playing field ensures that the approaches are kind of, that IoT is approached on a more level playing field. In terms of technology, bias is key. We need to raise awareness and become more aware of the biases that we have and that we embed within algorithms. We need to make sure we're using appropriate data for the insights. So we need to kind of audit the data and ensure that what we're doing, what we're collecting is the right data for producing insights. We can build systems that allow kind of a resident knowledge baseline to be involved in the technologies. So there might be different levels of the technologies, but if we can have kind of like a basic version that will enable people to participate, all people to participate, then it will include more people within the kind of transition to the more digital world. Use the data we collect to empower and not to have power over people. Again, this is something that we need to reiterate. And we need to be clear and transparent on the purpose of data and its ownership. So just to summarize, the kind of key messages coming out of the ethics research are that we need to operate ethically in the connected home sector. We have to do it, and particularly given the lack of regulation, it's the only way we can kind of ensure that we don't do harm and we minimize that risk. We need to work collaboratively, actively promoting ethical approaches and engaging in the conversation. Everyone will have different ethical issues and different examples of those ethical issues. So in working together, we can ensure that the risk of harm is reduced again. We've identified 2 core approaches to addressing these ethical issues, so using governance aspects and then looking at technology and how we can make changes within them. We need to facilitate the kind of discussion between all affected parties, so everyone who's affected should be able to have a say, and we need to find ways to do this. And then finally, a really key point is that it's not up to one person, body, or organization to decide what's ethical. As we've mentioned throughout, different situations will have different ethical issues and resolutions, so we need to ensure that that we're kind of not prescribing what's ethical. It needs to be an ongoing conversation. So in that vein, we want to put together a working group for ethical IoT in social housing. We want to bring together people who are really interested, but also those who might not be able to have that kind of voice previously, and bring together some of the key kind of actors in this area to develop best practice, looking at IoT standards, and if you're interested in getting involved in that kind of work, then please get in contact. My email address is just here. So Some of you might have already downloaded it, but the final report for the ethical research, connected and fair, is available now to download. You visit the ACO website, aco.co.uk/IoT. You can download it from there. And if you'd like if you'd like any more information or open any more discussions, you can feel free to email me. We're really keen to kind of progress this work and move on from here. We hope this is just kind of a starting point, and it's just there to get kind of conversations going. So thank you for listening today. I'm going to hand it back to Tina.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think that was a really interesting discussion, wasn't it, Chris? What are your thoughts on what Sam's just shared with us the last 40 minutes or so?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a hugely important topic. It's just something that we've been thinking a lot about over the last few years, and I think that the report that's got out there at the moment is a really, really valuable starting point. It's clear that the kind of next thing really is getting more people involved in terms of steering committee. So it's kind of industry led. And making sure that we're kind of taking this ethical approach as a whole industry, rather than just people doing lots of different things. So I think maybe some kind of future standard or something could be really interesting. I think the other side of it as well is the research was great, and there's lots of really interesting questions, but it kind of flagged additional questions, and stuff came out of it that made you think there's further research to do here, there's further work, there's more that we can try and understand from residents, and talking about specific use cases and things like that as well. So it's quite exciting really. There's a lot more to be done. It feels like we're doing the right thing, making sure everything goes in a sort of ethical direction. We've obviously got an opportunity to shape the industry, and I think we're all doing this for social good reasons. So we need to make sure that it lands in that way.
I think you're right. I think it's just the start of it, isn't it? I think when you look at the ethics, there's so much in it. It's interesting when Sam was mentioning the bias aspect of it as well, and that what you may have experienced in life previously would have a knock-on effect on the ethics and perspective of residents as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've seen different. So before we did before we engaged with Sam, we did as part of the Leeds project, the first phase of Leeds. We spoke to a lot of residents, spoke to over 100 residents on that, one-on-one, individually. And interestingly, although Sam's got good results there in terms of people over a certain age are more sceptical and others, younger people aren't. We also found that in some cases, if you can look into that a bit more detail, anecdotally, we found that people that are perhaps older but have a health issue, we're just absolutely happy with whatever technology can help them. So there's certain things, and that's what I was trying to say in the beginning around, there's got to be something in it for them, and it's got to be beyond, we're making sure your home's compliant, or, we're making sure we're giving you a preventative maintenance thing. It's got to be, what's in it for them? How does it improve their health and everything else? And there's huge opportunity in that. So that's the key really. It's getting the line right on what you're doing, making sure it's acceptable, and then making sure you're transparent with your data, and making sure that there's something in it for them. I think
we're just about starting to scratch the surface on this. I think it's good that it's been led by the University of Bristol. I think there's so much more that we can do. I think Sam mentioned an interesting point about collaborative working. I think as a sector, this is where it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. It is for the good of residents, isn't it? It doesn't matter where the residents are from, whether they're social, private, or homeowners, but ethics is a massive aspect to consider, and we're talking about a smart connected homes, but it's not related just to this. Yeah. It could be related to anything around innovation or technology, really, can't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think another interesting aspect that kind of Sam touched on there, and it's kind of his phrase, so I don't want to steal it from him, but the kind of elasticity of acceptance is a really interesting thing. So in the beginning, I was talking about how people used to view computers as something that were quite scary. They were kind of new. A lot of people didn't have them. People were worried about privacy. There was lots of conversations happening at industry level. A lot of people were unaware. And it is very, very, very similar to the current situation, and similar to most technologies that are coming out. And what's interesting is, over time, you do this kind of work, you learn from these deployments, and you kind of see, you understand what's acceptable, and that's how that technology evolves. But what's interesting is, as I said before, people now are completely accepting of computers, and there is no doubt that there is, the future will include smart homes everywhere. This is like an obvious thing that's going to happen. How that exactly looks is obviously an unknown thing. But the reality is, we would have got there. There might be some new laws around data. There might be a cultural direction we've gone in to do it, but that will be a thing, and people will be completely used to it, like having that kind of home health understanding.
I think it would be really good to have a British standard around ethics. So there's a close correlation between ethics and GDPR as well. I think we've got a few questions coming in already, but can I please ask yourselves as an audience, this is an opportunity for you to input into this conversation equally. Please keep the chat function going. Keep adding additional questions. We will be taking Q&As session at the end, and Sam will be back on. But I think it's really interesting what we're going to go through. So far, we've looked at the ethics and the research that Sam's done, which is really interesting in terms of the whole spectrum of ethics and how it links to potentially the GDPR aspect of it. But there are practical implementations being taken place with Leeds at the moment, aren't there, Chris?
Yeah, we're doing very close work with Leeds, and we'll hear more about that from them. And we've got Jordan working specifically on that project. And I don't want to steal Stephen's sandwiches right before he gives a presentation, because I'm sure he'll cover off some of that kind of stuff. But yeah, again, the first phase we did with Leeds and a bit with some of the work we did with Wolverhampton, we kind of very quickly realised that a resident app would have a big impact on that data transparency, something being in it for them. So it kind of helps with elements that we're seeing from the research, which is part of what drives our product decisions. This is why we're doing this.
And we're going to hear from Stephen Blackburn from Leeds City Council, has been part of the GovTech project, joined by Jordan shortly later, just to have a conversation about the work that we've done with yourselves around the resident engagement. We'll be back over shortly to you, but handing over to yourselves, Stephen and Jordan.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, and thanks for inviting me to this session today. The presentation that Sam gave there was really good, and I'm pleased to say I think we're ticking some of the boxes, so I think we're doing something right. So I'll probably duplicate to some degree some of what Sam said, but I guess more put it into a more practical context in terms of what we're trying to do here at Leeds City Council. So if I can just share my screen, I've got just a very short presentation, a few slides just to go through. So hopefully you can all see that. Good afternoon again, everybody. Stephen Blackburn. I work for Leeds City Council and lead on our Smart Cities programme. That's quite wide-ranging, and one of the projects that I'm working on is with HomeLink. But it covers on what we call our foundation. So that's the connectivity, whether that be LoRaWAN, which we're using on the project with HomeLink, or full fibre broadband, or Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth. So lots of different connectivity types there. Also looking at data and analytics, that we're collecting the right data and that we're reusing it and using it in the right way. And also digital inclusion, a big piece of work for us there to ensure that we close that digital divide as far as we possibly can. And then our 4 priority areas are climate emergency, health and well-being, mobility, and finally housing standards, which is why I've been invited onto this presentation today, and thank you very much for that. So if I just go through some of the slides that I've got. First of all, at Leeds, we want to really get involved in much more of the work that we've been doing with HomeLink, and be seen as an innovative city where we embrace innovation, where we deliver services in new and innovative ways, increasing efficiency in terms of how we deliver those services, but also take a very human-centered approach, and our citizens and our customers are at the heart really of everything that we do, and they should be really part of the conversations right from the very outset. In terms of innovation then, as has already been mentioned, data is much easier to collect now than it ever has been. Loads more Internet of Things devices that are out there. The cost of those are coming down. We can collect data inside people's homes in real time that we couldn't have done, even 5 or 10 years ago. And of course, then you've got all the, the privacy aspects to consider as part of that. Just to touch on something that I think Chris mentioned at the end of Sam's presentation there, we want to embrace innovation because customer expectations continue to rise. I will say, however, the problem that we have in housing is that our younger tenants are less likely to be engaged with us, but have higher expectations. And our older customers, our older tenants, have lower expectations. They're prepared to wait for a plumber maybe to come a couple of days rather than at 2 o'clock this afternoon. So they're prepared to wait a little bit, but they tend to still engage with us through traditional means. So we've got to balance that as well. But in terms of us being innovative and in terms of us using this new technology, we really need to thoroughly understand, how it will be used and what we're getting into. What we don't want to do is end up deploying a load of sensors, collecting a load of data, ending up potentially in a few months or a few years' time down a rabbit hole, and we didn't understand really what we were getting ourselves into. And before we know it, something on the front of the local evening paper or whatever, Leeds City Council has done ... with customers' data. We need to be really mindful how we're using data, how we're collecting it. And we need to think about not just the data, but also the software and the hardware. I will say, I've been doing this kind of work now for probably about 7 or 8 years. And whilst we've always been mindful about information governance, about data collection, about making sure that we don't, sort of lose that data, misuse it, all that kind of stuff. Absolutely on that. But I have to say, in terms of doing this work for about 7 or 8 years, and prior to that, I was in information governance for about 3 years as well. I can't say until very, very recently, until probably only in the last 6 or 7 months, has data and digital ethics really sort of shot up the league table of discussions, I suppose, and what we're talking about. I've had recent calls from the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, CPNI, and also from the National Cyber Security Centre as well. They are really, really keen on what councils, what technology companies are doing in the smart city space. This is now really hot on their agenda, and they're very interested all of a sudden in terms of what is being done. And I think that is because of this proliferation of new technology. All of a sudden it's kind of exploded. Lots of councils are jumping on the bandwagon and looking at how this kind of technology can help us deliver services. So we need to think about not just the software, not just the data, but also the hardware as well. So I put a picture up there of a box on a lamppost. What is in that box? And whilst we might be working with a trusted supplier in Leeds who we've worked with for years, who's put together the motherboard inside that device? Where's that being built? Is that in China somewhere? Who's put the firmware in that device as well? And I think we just need to think about stuff that we've maybe not really needed to think about before, because we've never been using this kind of technology in the past. I've put there overcoming data skepticism. I don't know if data skepticism is a phrase, but I will use it anyway. People are increasingly wary of how their data is being used. Lots more media news stories. You turn the news on, a big tech company has been collecting data that you didn't realize they were collecting, and they've shared it with so and so, and they're using it in a different way. So I do think, more than it certainly was 10 years ago, that data is on everybody's lips these days, and I think we're all much more aware, more mindful of our own personal data and what data is being collected, sometimes without us realizing it, and how that is being reused. So it's important that we work with our customers. We've always said that, and I think it's increasingly important as we use this new type of technology that we're talking about here. We want to do the right thing. We want to take our customers with us on this journey, and we can't just, I've said this with when I've been working with HomeLink, we can't just knock on somebody's door, on a council tenant's door, and rock up with a little box and say, don't worry, we'll just be collecting some data about the house, don't panic. They're not going to let us through the door. I certainly wouldn't let anybody like that through my door and collect data that I didn't know about. But really, this is about us delivering a better service, using the latest technology to help us deliver a better service, a more proactive service. It might be something to do with the council's house. It might be increasingly damp or become damp over a period of time. How can we be more proactive? How can we use technology that can help us address those problems before it becomes a major issue? But when we're working with suppliers such as HomeLink, for example, or ACO, or whoever it is, we need to make sure that the people that our partners, the people that we're working with, and further down their chain, I would say as well, that they have the same moral and ethical values as we do. Where we want to get to a point is that when we do knock on a customer's door in the future, they understand that the council is using technology, using data in absolutely the right way. And the reason we're doing that is to deliver a better service for them. I think we've got a while to get there because of this data skepticism, because of what the people see on the news. We kind of all get tarnished with the same brush to some degree. But I think working with our customers, we will always need to have those conversations. But I would hope that we can embed that kind of trust, and then we can work from there on future projects. And we've done some recent workshops looking at our new digital strategy for the city, and somebody in one of the workshops mentioned this. So I use this kind of very quick, that last bullet point everywhere now, because I think it just sums it up really, really succinctly. If we are open and transparent and engaging, then people know more about what they are, about what we are doing, and therefore we will be more they will trust what we're doing because they're involved in those conversations and engaged right from the outset. So in terms of that digital strategy, I'm not going to go through all of these because time is short this afternoon, but just really to give you some idea of the kind of priority and actions, priority areas and actions that we're going to feature in that digital strategy when it gets published. So for example, we will promote the tech for good movement by adopting human-centered, accessible, ethical approaches to co-design and production of products and services. Like I say, people are involved in those discussions and that co-design right from the outset. This is still to be discussed, but I think Sam mentioned it about getting as many people involved in these discussions as possible, and something that came out from the discussion at the digital strategy workshop. And I've put there, I think it's absolutely worth investigating something like a Leeds data ethics forum with voices from various community sectors and background that can provide challenge perhaps and scrutiny to what we're doing, but also input into the direction of travel, maybe horizon scanning and new understanding that we need to be aware of in the future as this develops. We will promote the adoption of Leeds City Council's data ethics principles, and I'll give you a taster of those on the next slide. We will identify the right technology that meets citizen needs, and we will work with industry and academia to build trust around machine learning, AI, in the future as well. And I think, I think it was mentioned. I think it was Chris that mentioned it. This is about increasingly us collecting more data, and really the work that we're doing with HomeLink, for example, to really help and assist our staff here in terms of when they log on first thing on the morning, which are the houses that they need to target, which are the ones that have just maybe or tipping over that sort of damp threshold, if you like, that we really need to target our increasingly limited resources on, which are the next ones that we need to focus on. So the system, the machine will assist us in helping us make those choices and make those decisions. It's not a leap of faith then to consider that maybe further down the line, that maybe when we become more used to that technology and we can trust it more, we have confidence in it, that maybe we don't need a person to sort of tick that box anymore, and maybe the machine automatically instructs the plumber to go out and we don't even need to know about it. I can see that's the direction of travel in the future. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're a long way off there, but you can see how that quite easily could become a reality. So in terms of those digital and data ethic principles then that I mentioned, and these are still being developed to some degree, but I think cover a lot of the points that Sam mentioned earlier, that we, in terms of data and technology, that it is used in an ethical manner and in line with council values, that it's applied for the benefit of the citizens of Leeds, that we risk assess against any possible biases. We need to really think about that. We all have inbuilt biases in us. And I think that's a real challenge for us to think about there, and the potential harm and discrimination that bias might lead to. That it's open, that data and technology is openly and transparently used where possible, and the implications of use is understood. That it's used for the betterment of our citizens and community needs, and that we consider the purpose of the use of that data and technology, the risks and the limitations are always considered, and is it appropriate in that particular instance. I think as well, and just referring back to the machine and learning and AI thing that I mentioned a couple of moments ago, that sufficient human oversight is employed and consistent with recognized standards of integrity and quality. So yeah, absolutely, we need sort of eyes on what is going on right now, and human intervention. If we take that human intervention to some degree away, we need to completely be aware, and fully understand of the implications of that and what that might lead to. And as of course I mentioned, partners, suppliers and third parties are adherents to council principles. They adhere to the same kind of moral and ethical values that we do. Just very briefly then, before I hand over to Jordan to give you a bit of perspective from his point of view. So the GovTech Catalyst that we've been working with HomeLink on is looking to address this problem statement. How might we use technology to improve the management of our housing stock that could lead to improved health outcomes of our tenants? So, that's great. The technology is there already. We can put a sensor in somebody's home and that gives us a reading. It tells us what's going on and we can make some decisions based on that. But really, the key thing, that we've been looking at with this is how does that impact on a tenant's health? And the health is intrinsically linked with the bricks and mortar and the property that our tenant lives in. So then you might be getting into a little bit of personal data potentially when you start talking about health. But also, even just a very basic level, how do we roll this out? How do we roll this new technology out to our tenants? And we've had lots of discussions around the legal basis, for example. Could we use the public task? There is some precedent for that. That is happening in some areas. But again, we didn't really just want to rock up and say, well, as part of what we're delivering here and part of this, your council house provision, we can just turn up with a box and we can just do this. We didn't really want to go down that route, certainly for this project. Now, when we look to roll out across 54,000 properties, we might need to have a think about how we effectively do that. But certainly for this project, we thought, this is important that we work with our tenants and that we work on a consent basis, and we encouraged volunteers to participate. But also, we need to think about, just think about all the sort of the real sort of detail, I suppose, about how we deliver this in the future. So we put a box in somebody's house that's collecting this data. Sometimes the reason, let's say, for the dampness in that house might be to do with the archetype, the property itself. It might be to do with how the person is living, the impact that tenant is having on the property themselves. So what do we do then if a person moves house and we've got a new tenant in the next day? Do we keep all that old tenant's data, or do we clear it and start from scratch. And we just need to think about, you know, how that data is managed, really. And you might be thinking that, well, that kind of data doesn't really, you know, it's not personal data or whatever. But, you know, if we're collecting CO2 data, for example, you can work out how much, you know, an average adult breathes out of CO2. So you can then probably work out how many people are in that house at any one time. So we need to be thinking about this. And is there something, when I talked about going down a rabbit hole, and something might not happen till, you know, 3 or 4 years down the line, when technology has advanced even further and we're collecting different types of data, might the data that we're collecting for this particular project have an adverse impact on something else further down the line? And we need to really consider that. We're not going to be able to eliminate all risk, but we really need to go into this with our eyes wide open. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hand over to Jordan. That's the end of the slides. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to Jordan, who can give you a feel for, you know, I guess the discussions he's had with our tenants and the kind of discussions that he's been having in terms of what we've just been discussing there. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to Jordan if I can.
Cheers, Stephen. Yeah, it's been really interesting working with the residents that are in the GovTech Catalyst scheme with Leeds City Council. We've had some fantastic engagement with them. We've got a Facebook group and WhatsApp groups, and that has really been what has provided us the opportunity to give back what Stephen was talking about there, with about not working, not just doing stuff to the residents, but also working with them and engaging them in whatever it is that we're doing so that they benefit, which goes back to what Chris was saying about making sure that they benefit from whatever this technology we're implementing is. And one very brief story about that is one resident so we've been sending out feedback forms, and one of the first questions we asked right back at the start of the scheme was about the acceptability of technology and what they might think about having a sensor in their bedroom. It's not something we've done, it's not something we're looking to do in this project, but we just wanted to see just what their thoughts were about that. And since the residents have received access to our resident app, so they can see all the data that we're collecting and what it means and what they can do to improve their own environment. One resident has come forward and said, actually, I would now consider having a sensor in my bedroom because I can see the value of it. So that really just proves the point of what everyone has said so far already today, that, you know, the benefit to the resident has to be there. They have to get something out of this. And there is that elasticity of acceptance of technology that Sam has mentioned as well, about attitudes can change over time if the resident can see the value and see the benefit to them in having this additional technology in their own home. Tina, Chris,
yeah, I'm going to say thanks for that, Jordan. I think that's about it from us. So if we want to hand back to Tina and do the Q&A.
Well, thanks very much for that, Steve and Jordan. As a really, really fantastic presentation. Lots of passion there and really, really interesting things that you've been able to share with us. And it's funny how you kind of see everything start tying together. You know, I really like that bit in the middle about transparency, knowledge, and trust, and that they're all the same. And you know, again, you know, once it's like a fear of the unknown, but once you have that data on the app and you can see what's being collected, you suddenly realize, well, actually, it's known now, and it's not that. It's not intrusive. There's nothing wrong with that. So that removes the fear, and then suddenly you start thinking, okay, well, there's actually benefits to this. I'm learning more about how my indoor environment affects my health, and suddenly they're thinking, well, actually, I spend a lot of time in my bedroom, so it's not that, you know, scary to have that kind of information. So it'd be good to have it there, even though that's not, you know, something we're looking at. So yeah, it's really interesting to kind of see how that ties together. And yeah, thanks very much for your time there, Stephen. Appreciate that, and Jordan, of course, as well. So I think we're moving to the Q&A. Before that, I think we have a poll question. Is that right, Tina?
That's right. We're going to be setting up yourselves a poll. So starting with the poll, quite a lot of you, 68% of you, said that you have incorporated ethics as part of the deployment of IoT. Hearing what you've heard from Sam and the conversation with Chris and I have had from Stephen and also Jordan, we want to ask you, will you now be considering ethics as a critical part of your IoT delivery? So will you now be considering ethics as a critical part of your IoT delivery? We've got voting coming through. So far, we're hitting 100%. There's many more of you in here, so expect the votes to rise. So we're coming to about 22 people with a lot more than 22.
No. I wasted our time then.
So still carry on voting through. Only 51% of you have voted so far. We'd like to get it up to about 70, please. Here we go through. So far, 100% of you are saying that you will be now using ethics as a critical part of your IoT delivery. I think that sums it up, doesn't it, Chris? I mean, we started off with 68%. We've ended up with 100% of the audience saying that's exactly what they'll be doing. Ethics isn't a small part of a conversation. It's not the end part. It is the conversation needs to begin at the start. I think we've got a few questions coming through. The first question is from Anonymous. Some you may have answered some is, Stephen, you mentioned that you've got as Leeds City Council, you've got your own principles for ethics. Sam's referred to some principles and ethics as general. To both of you, a question. Do you think there should be one standard ethics or principles at all? Starting with Sam.
Yeah, I mean, I think different organisations will have different ethical considerations. So if we all follow the same path, then it could get a bit messy. However, there are some core considerations within the IoT space in social homes that really need to be embedded within the programs that we kind of develop and implement. So there's definitely call for some kind of collaboration here, whereby we can put together a framework that might be broad enough to fit those kind of key considerations. It'd be nice to see what Stephen thinks.
What are your thoughts on that? If there was a national framework for ethical principles?
Yeah, I think often government tends to provide more guidance on generally on this kind of stuff, because I mean I've worked on open data for quite some time, and I've been screaming out for why doesn't the government have a standard open data portal that everybody can access, and why is there no direction on this is the standard that we should all approach? And I think they tend to steer away from that, and as Sam mentioned, because probably that we all have a slightly different approach and slightly different nuances, and we probably prefer us to develop it for ourselves. I have to say, Manchester have got, I think, 23 different principles. Open Data Manchester did something there, and they get more into the technology side rather than the data as well. So I think my view would be, and I have to say, and speaking from like I say, with the work that I've done with open data, I wish there was more clearer guidance in terms of that coming from above. Maybe with this is a starter for 10, and develop it to suit your local kind of needs. But I would say I think that probably in this particular area will be increasingly something that comes from government, because there's a lot of chatter about it. Like I say, from government departments, really, their eyes are wide open to this at the moment.
Stephen, do you not think it should be sector-led? I mean, Sam referred to creating a potential. The ethics and GDPR, there isn't a British standard for it, but don't you think it should be sector-led and not the government telling us as a sector what we should be doing?
Yes, as long as the sector can get their heads together and all agree, I suppose, is what I would say. Is what I would say to that. And I guess who steers that conversation. And I think generally the government does try to do that, and it will put consultation out, and it will encourage people from various sectors to get involved in that kind of conversation. The difficulty then is embedding it, without legislation and saying you must do this, which I think government is often not keen on doing. But yes, I mean, in terms of standards, for example, absolutely, the housing sector needs to tell us how the housing data needs to look like this and collect it in this way. As long as if we have a 5-year contract with HomeLink, let's say, and we collecting data in one particular way, and then we have a 5-year contract with another provider, we don't want to start from scratch. We want the data to look exactly the same with the new provider as it did with Homelink. Otherwise, it's a mess really, and it causes all sorts of trouble.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. I know there's like a lot more sudden interest in data standards over the last few years now. Data science has become, much more effective, and the requirement to have that kind of standardized data makes a big difference. I suppose with IoT, one of the benefits is that it's kind of time series data that is standardized in itself. But yeah, you are right. Obviously, when you move between systems, and when you get to the kind of insight level, that could certainly be more of a challenge. I would have thought. I was just kind of like thinking about I know you're on wider projects than just the smart homes project that you're working on. There kind of been any kind of ethical considerations, or has there been as much sort of talk in other projects that you might have been doing, or is it? I mean, I guess this is quite a hot topic in this sector, but
it is, but it's still an emerging area, and so for me, it's not really the project that we're working on with Homelink is the most detailed and sort of biggest projects that we're currently working, or that I'm certainly working on. Yeah. That's not to say our information governance colleagues who are putting those principles together, they are acutely aware that this. There are a lot of conversations taking place right across the council in terms of how we use new technology IoT devices in the future. So, for example, how do we, can we use this kind of technology to deliver telecare services for elderly people, enabling them to live in their own homes for longer and live more, independent lives in their own homes. So they are really keen on that. So we need to be absolutely mindful of the ethics around how we deliver this, how we utilize this new technology and deliver our services in the future. I mean, just one sort of example. I don't know if it's a particularly good one, but it just, it's an interesting one, I suppose. So we've recently deployed a load of footfall counters in various parts of the city, different towns around the district, to help us better understand footfall sort of post-COVID as the high streets reopen, and also to provide some of that information back to our customers as well, and shoppers, and they might want to. It tells you how busy the high street is at any one time, and they might make an informed choice as to whether they choose to go out at that point or not. But it also gives us a good indication as to that the high street's picking back up again and all that side of it. And I had a conversation. It was probably about 3 or 4 years ago now with a colleague in information governance, and I was saying that really footfall counters, they don't monitor, they don't identify anybody, they don't it's not a facial recognition or anything like that. Somebody just passes a beam and it just registers a thing. And he said, yes, but you need to be mindful. And now maybe he's maybe overthinking it, I don't know, but I think he makes a fair point. He says what you need to be mindful is where you situate that footfall counter. He says, not that you would, but for example, if you put a footfall counter at the end of my cul-de-sac, there is only me and my family would walk past that lamppost and into my house. So somebody can then work out the comings and goings of me and my family. So yes, it is. It doesn't really apply to this because we're talking about the high street where there's hundreds of people. But it's a fair point. We might deploy a counter or a device thinking this absolutely has no implication on anybody at all. But somebody might come along and say, well, have you thought about this? And actually, no, we hadn't. So we need to really think about all the different implications. Yeah,
I think you're right. And it's interesting because, and just tying it back to the sort of things like legislation and principles and things like that. GDPR has come out of challenges around data protection, and probably those things were obvious before GDPR from an ethical point of view. So a lot of things that were kind of obvious from an ethical point of view become sort of legislation to control something, in a positive way. But what's really difficult in these kind of scenarios, and again, even with GDPR in terms of like data sharing, and ownership, is that it becomes so fuzzy and complex in terms of what it means, and is open to interpretation. And it feels like potentially there's a risk that we're now going into a situation where we have that same challenge, but in these kind of scenarios. So how can you kind of create a guideline or legislation that would have told you not to put that counter in a particular place in case you catch one person going, and then you could get that secondary information? Again, it's kind of like another layer of fuzziness. You've got this balance between making sure that you can feel comfortable to innovate and take risks, but at the same time protecting people's rights, which is absolutely crucial to make sure, bring it right back to the beginning, that technology is used in a good way and not in a negative way.
We've got a few questions coming through. Stephen, question to you in terms of deployment of sensors to diverse communities. We've got ethnic diversity, community diverse in terms of disability, etc. A lot of what you talked about was that co-adoption and co-creation with residents, and that's quite a big part of that. So it's one part of a question is how are you, and also it's a question to you, Sam, in terms of did that come up on the research itself? Second part of the question is for Leeds City Council, how important is it? You talked about 3 parts of supply chain. How important is it to have a member of the supply chain that understands that engagement role?
So first of all, yes, I think I think it is, and that's the work that we're doing with HomeLink. They are very much involved in speaking directly to our tenants. So it shouldn't just be about us doing the tenant engagement side and then the tech company coming in and just sticking the boxes in somebody's house. I think the fact that HomeLink are working, to be fair, more closely with our tenants than I am. Really, it's probably a good one for Jordan to chip in on, because you're working absolutely closely with our tenants, and I think that's as it should be, because you will ultimately be delivering the technology in the future. So it's a face to the supplier, I suppose, much as anything else.
Just on that point there, is that a key consideration when you're procuring out innovation, like the sense technology, etc.? Is that a key consideration for many in procurement?
I don't think it is, and I don't think it has probably been for the council either. Previously, this is a very new, for us, a very new approach to working in this way, much more agile way, but working, in this kind of customer-centric, human-centered approach. We've done some work in the past on a smaller scale, doing some innovation labs, some hack days where customers were involved and invited to get involved in that. But this is really reaching out to communities and actually working with them directly. I think what I would say is where I think part of your question was, how do we do this or do we do this and how do we do this? I think one thing I would say where we need to improve on, and it's one thing, an area that HomeLink have really embraced, and I think needed to do it in this way, in all fairness, when we've done our smaller sort of innovation labs, our workshops where we've invited people in from all sorts of different backgrounds in the past, we've generally done them in the city centre, and we might have called it, a data event or an innovation lab, and we've invited people into the city centre. Well, we need to think about our language as well. If you've got innovation or data or digital in the title, it will certainly put some people off. If you're doing it in Leeds City Centre, it will put people off. We need to work in communities. We need to go reach out to communities where they are and work closely with our customers where they live, not expect them to come to us.
And what are your thoughts on that, Sam?
Yeah, just quickly, I think another group who we need to think about the digitally excluded as well. So those who might not necessarily even have the internet at their home, and how we can embed the technologies with them, and how we can include them in that. I think Stephen makes a really good point there about who kind of gets involved with these, even with the trials we've done in the past. And even the research, we used an online-based survey because of COVID, and only those who were kind of familiar with that technology were involved in the research. So we do need to think of new ways of going beyond those who might normally kind of inhabit those kind of digital spaces already.
So is it just about making sure resident engagement and people think about the customer base, also a consideration of procurement and how that should be written into a tender about engaging of communities is quite a vital part of this, isn't it?
It is absolutely, and the thing is, working with communities closely right from the outset will help us with that procurement process, because it will help us identify what we need to procure. Often, I would suggest that we've probably, spoken to a snake oil salesman in the past, let's say, and procured something that we didn't quite know what we were procuring, and you don't know until you've bought it and it doesn't quite do what it said on the tin. I think working in this way helps us, working with communities helps us co-design, co-produce solutions, so that when we do end up with going through a procurement exercise, we've kind of know exactly what we want that will help us deliver that service. We've helped co-design the solution. We're more confident that it will be accepted by customers. And the other thing as well is that with the GovTech Catalyst project, we've included part of the project board here at the council are people from legal and from procurement and from public health and adults and housing. Everybody that touches on this project has been involved right from the beginning as well. So when we do get to that point, then everybody's informed and knows what we're doing.
So it's an internal engagement process, an external engagement process with residents,
Absolutely.
understanding your customer base, co-creation, considerations for procurement, and having joint principles of ethics, maybe as a sector. On that note, we're just conscious of time. I'm going to ask you 3 points, Sam, and same to you, Jordan. Again, 3 points. If there's anything that you can give a message to the audience, what would it be?
Yeah, I think collaboration has quite clearly come out of this. I think more, maybe like some sort of standards for the sector, kind of more guidance from the government. And then, ultimately, we need to address this now. Like, it's something that needs to be done now. We can't put technologies in homes without having this as kind of like a baseline before we start doing it. So that will expose us to risk in the future, which, even Stephen's just given one example there of technologies that were put in for another reason and could potentially be used elsewhere. So we need to do it now.
Stephen, 3 points from you? Yeah,
I would say collaboration. I always say that, and I think it's about sharing best practice and learning from each other. So I'm always all ears when it comes to that side of it. We can always learn. Engagement with your customers, absolutely fundamental, is key to this. That will, increase its success and adoption, I would say. And it's all about being innovative. We want to adopt new technology, but we've got to do it in the right way. Otherwise, we'll come unstuck later on.
Jordan.
Yeah, I'd say collaboration again. That's clearly the top priority there. I think the second one would be don't underestimate your residents. I've got numerous examples of residents surprising you. They'll come to you and say they can't do so and so, and 5 minutes later they're there, they're ready, they're doing it. And finally, I'd say the technology can be used for the benefit of both the landlord and the customer and the resident, and that is clear within the scheme that we're running as well. And keep that in mind when looking at procuring this sort of technology, because it is vital, providing that benefit to both landlord and resident.
I think it's interesting that we talked about creating a framework. Sam gave his details earlier. If you are from a social housing sector and are keen to carry on this conversation, please email Sam. We will put his contact details out to everybody as well. And if you want to carry on this conversation about ethics and GDPR, we are looking to create a forum at some point in time, and Sam will be in contact with you. I'll hand it over to you now, Chris.
Yeah, so just a final thanks very much, Stephen, for joining this call. Jordan and Sam, I think it's been a really good day, really good kick-off to the ethics work that we're doing. I think there's a lot more work to do, but this is a good kind of stake in the ground. So thanks again for your time, and thanks everybody for listening.
And thank you very much. Take care.